Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Don Poland. I'm with the firm of Goldman York Property Advisors out of East Hartford, Connecticut. With me today in the audience is Alyssa Fleming, who is one of our data analysts that worked on this study. Today, I'm actually using the plan itself. I'm not providing a shortened presentation. That doesn't mean I'm going to go through the plan page by page. But I truly want to introduce you guys to the plan document itself to hopefully pique your interest and get you functioning within the plan. Number two is it's a large and complex study, and I haven't figured out how to synthesize it down into a short presentation also. So I'm going to run you through it and give you kind of an overview and some key points. So let's get started. I want to thank the WestCOG and the steering committee that worked with us. Extremely helpful in our efforts. As you can see, the organization of the plan here, which I will talk about each of these chapters as we encounter them. And I'm going to skip over the executive summary at this point and delve right into the plan. So the key questions we were trying to answer through this study was, what is the most effective way to expand the supply of ADEC qualified housing units? And which methods or combined methods are most viable to reach A, a moratorium, or B, the 10% threshold? And these are kind of two questions that, communities continue to struggle with. In doing this, knowing that this was an affordable housing finance study, we knew that this was truly about market feasibility, which in general we know is there, but financial feasibility. And therefore, we very much took a market approach to this in trying to understand how housing markets function and also how affordable housing functions within the greater housing market. And for me personally, as a planner with 30 years of experience, a planner who works on both sides of the table, representing developers doing 8-30G applications and also representing municipalities and their zoning commissions in various ways, I've always felt that there's been this disconnect between market and zoning, and especially 8-30G. So two things I want to point out here at the beginning is, one, in the context of 8-30G, while I recognize the stick factor of it that communities feel threatened by, from a public policy standpoint, we've actually kind of pushed the financial responsibility onto the private sector. We've said, we will give you various zoning incentives, right? If you provide and maintain affordable housing at these thresholds for this number of years. So the cost of the housing goes to the private sector. The public benefit is the housing itself, and not to claim that the developer doesn't get benefits, they do get those bonuses. But at the end of the day, it's been that idea of the cost of housing on the developer is challenging. Because if you then sit on the developer side and you try and pencil out a pro forma, it's hard enough penciling out a market rate development. And then when you have to factor in that 30% of the units are going to be paying reduced rents, it creates this challenge to the developer. So moving along here, as part of this study, there was a few deliverables that were provided. The affordable housing finance study, also a significant appendix to this report with the background financial data on the financial analysis we did. There is also a companion Excel file on housing programs, and it's queryable in various different ways. And then also, I believe it ended up being contained in the appendix also, is the methodologies. We tried not to overburden the text with our methodology, and we explained all of that later. So the spatial organization of housing markets, and this is where I think, and this is where we found there's kind of a big disconnect between zoning and markets and how markets function. 8-30G kind of has this inherent assumption that every community can support 10% of its household as affordable at those required thresholds. But all communities aren't created equally. Some are more viable in the housing market than others. And we may typically think of that in the terms of income and cost, but it's actually spatial organization. It's the relationship between home and place of work that becomes critical. So properties that are nearer to a regional core versus properties that are distanced function differently within the marketplace. The more accessible a property is to a job center, the more valuable it most likely will be, and the more viable it will most likely be. The lower left-hand paragraph of this page, one of the things we use is commute times to kind of help us define markets. And I think what's key is one of the interesting things is only 23% of commuters nationally commute over 34 minutes to work. However, the national average of commute time is 28 minutes. So there's a ton of people commuting between like 28 minutes and 32 minutes. But the moment you hit that 34-minute mark, the data just drops off. It's a cliff. People don't commute a long distance. So, the elephant in the room down in this portion of the state is New York City. And we start seeing that in the data as I go through this. There's kind of two regions here. There's the northern tier and the southern tier. And the southern region is more accessible, the Metro North lines, the branch lines, the I-95 corridor, and just the time distance equation into New York City. And then your two large job centers within the region are ultimately Stamford and Norwalk. You then have another job center, kind of Danbury up to the north there. But you can start to see as we go through the data, the southern portion of the region emerging as the stronger holler market. And we all know that kind of intuitively. So proximity to transportation networks is important. Sub-regional centers are important. And then high amenity values of communities, strong school systems, which most of your communities have, and then everything else, the bucolic Fairfield County, southern Litchfield County character, New England character that exists down here, and the high quality of life. Those all play into kind of how the housing market organizes on a regional scale. So we've tested this in various ways. I use this example I did a few years ago. If you take comparable properties, a 2,200 square foot Cape up in the Hartford region, same amenities, 2.5 bedrooms, 2-car garage, acreage, so forth and so on. And then you look at it in the context of time distance from the core. What you see is the most distanced property is the lowest value per square foot, and the nearest to the core is the highest value per square foot. And we saw that also within your region. And that organization then becomes critical to kind of how this study played out. We built these typologies ultimately by analyzing density and zoning and housing growth rates and home values and market rents and median rents and affordability and so on. We went through a ton of kind of metrics to ultimately, do you need me to accept those or? You're doing them? Okay. It popped off my screen before I could get to it. So this series of slides here, and I'm not going to get into them in great detail, but essentially this is our analysis. We started with density and then we looked at housing growth rates, and you start maybe starting to see kind of maybe a difference between the north and the south here. And then we get into home values, and that becomes a pretty stark one. Housing values are much stronger to the south than they are to the north. And we do recognize kind of the urban cores having lower values. That's not saying they're low value and so forth. So we start seeing this kind of spatial organization of the region, looking at median rents, median home values. Throughout the study, we used both the regional median and the state median, recognizing that the state median comes in to play in the 8-30G calculations. And ultimately, this led towards building out typology in what we call urban core, urban fringe, suburban, and rural. And we can see them color coded here, with the darkest blues being the urban core, the lighter blue being the urban fringe, then lighter suburban, and then the rural or ex-urban. And we also use things like access to public infrastructure, whether that be public water, public sewer, public transit, the commuter rail lines. We also use the nationally recognized walkability index to work into that matrix. And I forget how many there were. If you take all of your community's zoning regulations, there's hundreds of different zoning categories. And we actually equalize them into 20 zoning categories across the region and use zoning as a metric for looking at density, looking at yield potential and so forth. And that ultimately gets us to this key typology, kind of, this is how the region organizes itself. And the urban cores are found mostly in that kind of coastal corridor, and then up in Danbury. And then the urban fringe is tightly, related to those. You can also see it along the branch lines of Metro North, and then the suburban in this lighter shade of green, and then the rural being the yellow shading. Now, there are some interesting things. If you look at Greenwich, for example, from a density standpoint, it meets the typology category for rural, but we also know that it's almost completely built out. It's really large homes on really large lots that creates this rural-esque feeling, but it's not like it's Reading, where most of it is undeveloped forest land and so forth. So there are some differences within those typologies that we recognize. And then we worked in commute times into this, as I already introduced earlier. We then took a deep dive into 8-30G, which most of you are probably very familiar with, but it's the state requirement that if a community doesn't provide 10% of its housing stock as affordable, qualified, and defined by the state, which is assisted housing, specific kinds of rental housing, CHFA, USDA mortgages, and then set aside developments with deed restrictions, and also mobile manufactured homes. If you don't meet the 10% threshold, then you're subject to 8-30G. And I believe all communities are subject to 8-30G, but 3 within the WestCOG region. So we looked at that and how that plays out across the region. We analyzed for the thresholds, the 10% thresholds, percent of affordable housing provided in each community. That breakdown is shown here by community. We also took a look at the HUD fair market rent areas. There's 3 that kind of overlap into the WestCOG region. To start providing kind of a look at what are our affordability levels in terms of income by persons per household. And we also did a needs assessment to kind of determine what is the ultimate need in affordable units by community and across the region. So this started to show us kind of what is the market here in the context, at least in the context of need. Just because there's need for affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean there's real or actualized demand, but we can quantify the need. We then looked at the median household incomes both on the rents and the incomes both on the state level and on the regional level, to start figuring out, what are the affordable rents? What are the affordable purchase prices? And this is all leading into ultimately then the financial feasibility analysis. So market rent comparison on the left and market home value comparison on the right. The rents, you'll notice, are more patchy, kind of across the regions. And then the home values, you can kind of see that north-south divide in difference. One of the things that becomes evident as we go through the financial feasibility on this is it's much harder and much more costly to provide affordable housing or 8-30G qualified housing on the home ownership side. Now, there are strategies and things that we recommend in the end that we'll get to, but the rental side of the market is really where the greatest need is, the greatest demand is, and ultimately it's more financially feasible being able to hit those reduced AMIs on the rental side. We also did a deep dive, mostly Alyssa did a deep dive into the moratorium housing unit equivalency points, and taking a look at what, how many points would a community need to actually achieve the moratorium. And then also what is kind of the path of least resistance or the quickest way to get to moratorium. The challenging thing there is the quickest path forward to achieve the moratorium is ultimately, sorry that was blocking part of the screen, is ultimately targeting the lowest income households, 40% AMI or below. It's at 40% AMI based on the state formula that you earn the highest equivalency points. So the more, what I will call the housing you provide, the more points you earn and quicker to get there. And just to say, if you were doing a bunch of, owner occupied 80% AMI, you're only going to get 1 point in the system per unit. The challenge there is, I understand the policy drive, providing more points to achieve more affordable housing at lower income levels. That is where the greatest need is. The greatest need for affordable housing is below 50% AMI. But at the end of the day, if you're now talking financial feasibility, housing below 40% AMI or below is going to cost the most to produce, or at least is going to cost the most in public subsidy to produce and maintain. So you end up with this challenge, right? And this is further analysis and then ultimately kind of getting to how do these numbers work out for a pathway forward on the equivalency points. And then the next chapter gets into a discussion around zoning. I'm going to skip over this mostly, but I just want to say a few things about it. We tend to, I think in the discussions around affordable housing, zoning becomes a very easy target. Everyone likes to blame zoning. That if it wasn't for zoning, if it wasn't for single family, if it wasn't for large lots, that we wouldn't have the affordability problems that we have. And there is some truth to that. A single family large lot home is more expensive than other styles of homes and requires a certain income level to achieve and so forth. So there are some truths in there, but there's more to the complexity of it. Zoning controls the supply side of markets. If you have a town that's 100 acres in size, just to make the math easy for me, 1 lot zone, 1 acre zoning will get you 100 units. Half acre zoning will get you 50. Quarter acre unit will get you 200 units. And quarter acre zoning will get you 400 units. And if you allow multifamily at 10 units per acre, then you get 1,000 units, right? So zoning directly influences the supply side of the supply and demand curve, right? We control kind of the supply and what the yield could be on the zoning side. But the market determines the demand side. And things like job growth, things like population growth, things like household formations are the demand drivers that determine the demand side. And then that spatial organization of market. Ultimately, where is that property, that lot, in relationship to things like job centers, in relationship to the transportation networks. So demand is going to be higher, just to say, in a New Canaan than it is going to be in a New Milford or a Reading that are more distant and less accessible. That was kind of the purpose of building out those typologies, to kind of start recognizing that these typologies function differently within the housing market, and we need to approach them differently. So I guess my end statement on zoning is not the sole culprit, and we're not going to solve housing through zoning alone. We have to recognize other factors, including market factors. Which comes to kind of the crux of this study, which is this modeling of real estate development scenarios. So getting back to what is the most cost-effective way to expand the supply of H-30G qualified housing? That is a finance question. It's a housing finance question. And then what are the methods to achieve moratorium or H-30G? We do work for private developers, helping them build out their pro formas, for everything from market research through their pro formas and so forth, to getting through the land use approval processes. And we've developed a model of testing kind of pro formas for their financial feasibility. And two things that we use both relate directly to the return on investment. Now, everyone has this feeling that, oh, the developers are just getting rich, they just want to return so much more. But the fact is, return on investment is complicated, and they're not always getting rich. And in that context, it's an investment asset class. Real estate investment in some ways is no different than the stock market. And the fact is, it's a very high risk way to invest. Right now in a credit union CD, you can probably get 5%. If the return on a real estate investment was only 5%, why would anyone actually put their money there? It's too risky. Time, denials at local land use, litigation for multiple years, collapse in the market by the time you finally get through your litigation or what have you. There's just too much risk out there. So it has to return more. So we look at two things: the rate of return, or what's called project IRR. That's the overall project's rate of return. And then we also look at the rate of return, or equity internal rate of return. Project IRR return is kind of what the lenders would be looking for, and the equity is what the private investor would be looking for. And they have kind of their own thresholds. And we kind of say here, the more important one is typically the equity IRR, and it's between a 13 and 20% return. In the marketplace now, you also have to remember, a growing, booming market, say Houston, if I've got $1 million burning in my pocket, right, burning a hole in my pocket, I can easily find a development to return me 18 or 20% in, say, the Houston market, and put my money there. So we're not just competing locally, we're competing nationally for where investment dollars are flowing. In Connecticut, kind of in this market, we find 13 to 20% is what's needed. Used to be as low as 12%. You can stretch it down maybe 11 at times, depending on who the developer is, what their needs are on equity and so forth. But that kind of becomes the threshold for saying, you know, is this viable? The other thing we looked at in these models, and I'll get back to them or talk more about them, is the fact that what I opened with, the developer is footing the cost of the development and they're subsidizing those reduced affordable rents over a 40-year period, or the income for purchase. We also looked at then, what is the public participation side? And we kind of approach this from policy perspective of public-private partnerships. What can government do to help subsidize, to help build affordable housing through subsidy? And those subsidies can be in many ways. 8-30G uses essentially density and a pathway through zoning, right? But I think what we've learned through experience and so forth is that density alone isn't necessarily enough of incentive. It works in some places. In those places where it works really well, they're the communities that feel the most put upon by 8-30G applications, because it does work. In communities where that density doesn't work, we're pretty confident that many of them have never even seen an 8-30G application. And we took a look at that in little ways. But there's other ways. If you have excess land, you have an old elementary school that you've closed down and you're not using it for anything. You know, what does a land donation into an affordable housing development do? How can it play a role? Or direct grants and subsidies, low-income tax credits, CHFA funding for affordable housing, permit fees and waivers. You know, we're allowed to collect a reasonable fee for the time of staff to review zoning applications and building permits. Every time I do the calculations, I'm just overwhelmed, you know. I see building permits that cost like 7.5 staffing years of employment. It'd pay for the building official for 7.5 years. We view them as a revenue stream. A number of years ago, I was working on a development. Goldman York was working on a development in New Rochelle, mixed use, nearly $100 million project, and we were retained by a developer to help go to the to New Rochelle to get a tax abatement worth about $10 million, about 10% of the project. And as we were going through and doing all the financials, preparing for that, we came to realize between local and state fees, there was $6.7 million in permitting. And I was kind of chuckling to myself at, like, if you just got rid of the permitting fees, we might not actually have to ask for a tax abatement. So fees can be substantial and therefore can play a role in ultimately the affordability. And then outright tax incentives, whether it's TIF districts, abatements, and so forth. The state just passed some more flexibility on the abatement route. So we went through and essentially built out pro formas. They're in the appendix. These are the summaries. I'm not going to go into each of these until I get to the summary table. But essentially here, we did single family models. We did large apartment models. We also did townhouses, mid-size apartments, office conversion into apartments, single family conversion, duplex, triplex, and quadplex. We did some of these fully as market rate. If you look at this single family in a rural typology, no financial assistance, so totally market rate, 5 units based on zoning allowed. And look at the returns here, 19.9, 25.5. You want to know why developers like building single family residential homes at market rate? There it is, great returns. So long as you can get the approvals, they return really well. Add in an affordability component to a 5-unit development, 30% works out to you have to do 2 units, that's actually 40%. But then look at what the rates of return, 0.8 and 1.3. Why is almost no one building single family residential 8-30Gs? There you have it. Now, provide the density bonus, and let's say we as the developer can utilize we're not using 8-30G here. Let's assume the municipality allows a cluster with a larger unit yield, so 24 units, 7 as affordable, only at 80% AMI, not the 8-30G 60 provision. And look at the returns, 12.8 and 26.8. That density goes a long way here, and there was some form of financial assistance. We may have done land contribution on that. You can start seeing here that different approaches work better than others. And we tried to put them with their likely typology where they were most likely.
So the detail on these returns will be in the models in the back?
Yeah,
okay.
And much more detail on what the models are. So it starts showing you kind of the complexity of actually building affordable housing. One, as a challenge on the developer side, but I'm not here to sympathize with developers. The real point is kind of this financial assistance. If you are a community that's serious about getting some affordable housing built, what can you do in partnership with a developer to make it more likely that that development will be built? Can you reduce or waive permitting fees? Can you throw in some excess land to provide them the land to develop on? All of those things. Can you attract, low-income tax credits or CHFA funding, help the developer attract those into development? Anything you can do to help get the financial assistance into the deal is going to improve the opportunities for actual returns. We also took a deep dive into accessory dwelling units, since they're such a hot topic, both on the mandated state legislation and also on just the view as them as an easy avenue. We've got so many single family homes. We have a changing household structure, more multi-generational households, more single person households, and so forth. The accessory dwelling units provide a unique and interesting opportunity, and planners like to promote them. I've actually always been hesitant on it. I'm not sure these things are actually financially viable. I was shocked when our data analysts ran the numbers, did the financial feasibility on them, and what we found is they are financially viable. The cost to build them versus the affordable rents they can return at, say, 80% state median is fiscally positive. They return. What we struggled, and we did 2 scenarios. One was a ground up, build a second structure on the property as the accessory unit, and the other one was a remodel, either convert an existing basement or an existing garage on the property into a unit, seeing what the differences would be on those. Both come back financially feasible. If you look at the IRRs down here on the ground up, 11.2 and 18.2, look at over here on the remodel. You have a walkout basement and you convert it, and your return 17.4 and 40.4. These are really financially feasible. The challenge for us was 2 things. We tried academic research, we tried national research, and we tried to do our own with MLS. We cannot quantify the impact that an accessory dwelling unit has on the primary unit. So let's say you have a $500,000 property, you spend $100,000 on accessory unit. Is your property now worth 600? Is it worth 7? Is it worth 5? We couldn't quantify what that impact was. There's just not enough data out there to quantify that. So then it becomes this kind of, people do it because of an in-law, because they have a need. That's probably how these come into existence. And then some of them continue in the marketplace. But you're also asking a leap of faith by the owner to become a landlord. And that's one assumption I don't think we pay a lot of attention to, is not everyone wants to be a landlord. So you may have an accessory dwelling unit that you used for your, mother-in-law, who's now, passed on, and you may not want to take it out to the marketplace as a rental. Maybe a family member or something But it's just, you don't want to be a landlord. So we think they remain in a niche environment, even though financially they are very viable. So some of our findings, I've already alluded to going through this. We think you have to recognize, not all markets are the same. Your north and south markets are different. As you saw how the typologies play out, every town's not solely within one typology. You have different market dynamics going on in different locations within your town. You get in the southern portion of, the region down along the coast and so forth. This section, and most of these towns have all four typologies within them. That created a challenge, and then how do we present our findings, back to you and our recommendations? Because we can't just say, New Canaan, you're this typology, do this. So we ended up organizing around kind of what are the typologies and how we present recommendations. There's no silver bullet that we found. At the end of the day, it's costly to produce affordable housing. It's costly for the developer, and it should also be costly for government if government's actually, putting skin into it. 8-30G doesn't really conceptualize that beyond the zoning bonuses that are provided statutorily. But for a municipality, if you truly want affordable housing, the most viable is at 80% AMI. The rental side is easier than the home ownership side. It's more financially feasible. And we did find a few interesting things along the way. One of which is conversions of single family residential houses into duplexes, triplexes, or quadplexes. The quadplex is the most financially feasible. It makes sense. One unit becomes 4 versus 3 or 2 with the duplex, but all of them are financially feasible. Now, I know from a zoning standpoint, I know from a kind of neighborhood, I'm not supposed to use this word, but neighborhood character standpoint, I know not all locations within a community would be acceptable for the conversion of your single family houses into duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. But if you accept the fact that it is a very viable path to go down, and if you can identify either individual properties or specific locations where conversion could work, it's a very affordable option. In the conversion of commercial space, commercial office into housing, we also found that to be very financially viable, provided you're not dealing with an old mill brownfield site, but just take your outdated, outmoded, once Class A office building that now is sitting vacant because of crash in the office market. And so long as the configuration of the building, meaning it's not overly deep, creating these caverns. So long as the configuration works out, the conversion into multifamily rental is actually very financially viable. Another thing that we found was, and this was based on kind of a hypothesis I'd been wanting to explore for a long time. It actually started with me in Farmington, Connecticut. If anyone's familiar with Farmington, wealthy community, prosperous suburb, a lot of 1960s, 70s, and 80 era apartments that once were great, top of the market, top grade properties. And now they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, and they're kind of worn and tired. And they're the weaker product in the market. Doesn't mean they're vacant or like substantially run down, but it's just there's newer modern product that's commanding $2,000 and $4,000 rents. And these things are, $1,500 to $2,200, depending on what they are. So the idea was, if you have an owner with, say, a 200 unit apartment complex that's kind of marginally obsolescent, cash flow is probably a struggle, investment in the property is probably a struggle for them. Is there a way for a municipality, knowing that an already built unit is cheaper than one you have to construct, could say, Farmington approach a developer and say, we'd like to purchase deed restrictions on 10% of the units. And what would that cost? The idea being the incentive to the owner of the development is it's an influx of cash that they can actually invest into the property. If I were advising a municipality, I'd require it to be invested into the property and not just pocketed. But we wanted to test that. So we did, and we actually queried your whole region for apartment complexes that would meet this criteria and age and other things. And we identified, the existence of some. We looked at the data we could get on them, and we ultimately came up with this finding and table here. Market rent on a studio, $13.59, 80% AMI, monthly rent, $15.51. You see 80% AMI is actually outpacing the market rent on this tired property, right? And the difference between market rent and AMI, and then over to here, am I on the right
Why could you
table?
get more than market rent on an 80%? I mean, I'm
Yeah,
confused.
in
I
the
mean-
one, so in the Hartford market,
Yeah,
in the Hartford market, not necessarily down
okay.
here. Well, no, that was down here too, though, but this is the whole thing. In a softer market overall, incomes aren't as high in the Hartford market overall. We actually find that studio units, their their market rate rents actually run lower than what 80% AMI is. One bedrooms can flip, they can go either way, they can be just over or just under. So the market rents are actually paralleling 80% AMI. That's part of this, when we have these affordable housing debates and discussions, it's like 80% AMI is not low income. I mean, market rents on studio and one bedroom units are often very close. Down here, yeah, it's a little tougher in that area. So I'm sorry, I was working off the wrong table, but this is what we found. So market rate valuation on that studio unit that already exists, about 221,000, 80% AMI, if we were to put a deed restriction on it, would reduce the value to about 200,000. The difference being just under 21,000. Play this out across each of these and what you end up, and then this is the cost to build new. So state AMI, if we use that as the multiplier to qualify for 8-30G, you could buy studio units probably for about $22,000. Deed restrict them at 80%. One bedroom's at about 53,000, two bedrooms at 131, and three bedrooms gets a bit pricey, 271. But you see, those are all running lower than what the actual construction cost would be. This is a very viable option. And if you think about in terms of trying to get to the 10% threshold or trying to earn equivalency points, 200 unit development, you want to purchase 15%, that's 30 units. You pick up 30 units of studios and one bedrooms. You instantly have those units. You don't wait a bunch of time for them to be constructed. And B, you instantly start earning equivalency points towards your moratorium. So we think there's something viable here. Now it's going to take time, effort, and money to actually, work deals like these. So the recommendations, we started off with we categorized them. Market typology recommendations, regional recommendations, and then local recommendations. So using typologies, we then recommend that these are probably some things to consider. Percent affordable. If we're not talking 8-30G, just trying to be qualified with 8-30G, aiming for 12 to 18% of the units to be qualified, or something less than 20%, is more financially feasible than saying if you're going to do an affordable housing development, you need 30%. One of the weaknesses of 8-30G It requires 30% of the units, and it requires half to be at 60% AMI, half at 80% AMI. The high percentage of units overall, 30%, and
SMI.
the low percentage of AMI, especially the 60%,
SMI.
really, I mean,
For all of us, it's SMI.
sorry, yes, SMI, really undermine the financial feasibility. So if you could do 18% of the units at 20% AMI through an inclusionary zoning provision, you're more likely to achieve financial feasibility than strict 8-30G calculations. Income levels targeting 80% AMI is going to be easier than 60% AMI. And getting down to the 40% AMI, you know, or below, you really need low-income housing tax credits, state dollars, or so forth. Housing styles in the urban core, you know, focusing on large, high-density unit types, high percentage of studio and one bedroom based on kind of the characteristic, based on what the market tells us. 45% of rental units in Connecticut are single-person households. That stat in and of itself tells us that's where the greatest demand is. And we went through, I don't want to belabor this, we did this for the urban core, we did this for the urban fringe, we did this for the suburban, and we did this for the rural. We then made regional recommendations to the COG, and that really focused on this idea of creating an affordable housing resource center within the COG, that the COG be this kind of providing leadership, education, and technical experience and so forth back to the region. And then we made a bunch of specific recommendations like a regional affordable housing trust fund, community land trust using recent legislation, working with local housing authorities, the creation of a regional housing authority, purchasing of deed restrictions and so forth. Roles that the WestCOG could make. And then at the local level, we made a bunch of recommendations, things like inclusionary zoning provisions, affordable housing trust funds, property tax incentives, permitting fee waivers, single family conversion to multiplex units, cluster subdivisions, you know, not just about open space, but about achieving greater affordability, land donations, CHFA and USDA mortgages. These are a giveaway to you by 8-30G. The households that qualify for a CHFA mortgage do not qualify at 80% AMI or don't necessarily qualify at 80% AMI. The more of these loans, homeowner loans, you can get into the community, the higher your percentage is. You know, getting out there and marketing these, working with realtors, it's a role the WestCOG can play. Working with realtors, working with builders, working with CHFA themselves, and trying to get as many of these as possible can go a long way of moving you towards the 12%, the 10%. You know, housing affordability plans, purchase of deed restrictions in existing units, as I discussed. We then make some legislative recommendations, recognizing this cannot be solved simply at the local or regional level. And how could things, you know, what could the state do to assist? That's not necessarily opening up 8-30G to a giant bloodbath, but are there other ways? But I think there does need to be further debate about 8-30G. When I said not all communities are created equal, 169 towns, 140 are subject to 8-30G. Of those 140, I can't remember exact numbers, I don't want to go back looking for it. Of those 140, only like something like 117 that don't have probably never had an 8-30G application. Why? Because a distanced rural community with a softer housing value, you can't make the subsidy, the developer subsidy of the affordable units work in the pro forma, in the financial feasibility. So certain communities get put upon more than others because the numbers work within those communities. I think having a market discussion around 8-30G opens up an opportunity for a wider discussion about what we're trying to achieve with 8-30G.